We're so glad that you're tuning in to listen to this sermon. It's part of our weekly worship service here at LOPC, and our hope is that as you listen to it, you'll hear God's word to you.
So our travel adventure story today from the Bible is not a joyful journey. It's not a terrific trip. In fact, it's about the worst travel story you're ever going to hear. It's true. So maybe think for a moment about the worst travel experience you've ever had. And what I'm about to share with you is a lot worse. I can pretty well guarantee that. It concerns a young man by the name of Joseph. And in the book of Genesis, Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham. So Abraham was given a promise by God that Abraham's descendants would multiply and become a great people, that God would bless them, and through them a great blessing would come to all people. And Abraham held on to that promise, even though it was very unlikely that it would ever come true. And he passed that promise on to his son Isaac, who passed it on to his son Jacob. And now we're in the fourth generation. And Jacob, who was also known as Israel, has 12 sons. And 10 by one mother, who are kind of a family, and then 2 by another wife. And of all the 12 sons, did Jacob have a favorite? Oh boy, did he have a favorite? He did. And his favorite was Joseph. And he doted on Joseph and gave him special privileges and perks. And you know, it's possible that parents can identify one of their children as being kind of a favorite, right? I mean, that can happen. But you know, you don't want to make a big deal out of it, right? Because that's not going to end well. Well, Jacob never got that memo. That memo of, you know, you can play favorites a little bit for reasons related to situation or affinity or whatever, but you really don't want to go public with that in a big way. Jacob does, though. He gifts his son Joseph with what? You remember? With a coat, a magnificent coat called the coat of many colors. And Joseph packed it away and never wore it. No, of course not. He wandered around in front of his brothers, showing off his coat, celebrating his status. He was daddy's favorite. Life was good. He could rub it in their faces all the time. And that made his brothers what? Mad, jealous, you got it. And then Joseph intensifies all this because he shares some dreams. God gave some dreams to Joseph, which foretold that he was going to be a great instrument in God's plan, you know, to make a great people. And Joseph kind of uncritically shared these dreams with his brothers, which involved, I don't know, little things like his brothers bowing down before him. So you get the picture here. And Jacob he's like aware of what's going on. I mean, he knows that the situation's not good with his boys. And so one time he decides, you know, I'll just get him a little quality alone time together. That'll solve it. I'm going to send Joseph out to his older brothers. They're out in the field watching the flocks at some distance. You know, he'll track them down and bring some goodies, and they'll sit down around the campfire and, you know, they'll work things out. That's what brothers do, right? I mean, what could go wrong? Well, let me tell you what can go wrong. And that's in Genesis chapter 37. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And they saw him from a distance. And before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. And they said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of all of his crazy dreams." But when Reuben, one of the brothers, heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Well, let's not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father later." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with the sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. And then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." Just let that sink in for a moment. And his brothers agreed. And when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifted him up out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. So the author of Genesis is doing their level-headed best to give us some context for what the brothers did, right? I mean, they want us to know Joseph was a little out of control. He was celebrating his special status, rubbing it in their faces. That made them very jealous, very angry. And yet it really does nothing to minimize the utter despicable nature of the brothers' actions. I mean, he's done no direct harm for them. He's not threatened his brothers in any way. He's just, he's being a kid. And he's not going about things the right way. We'd agree with that. But when they see him coming, they conspire to kill him. And it's only the intercession of one of the brothers, Reuben, who steps in and says, we don't want to do that. Let's just put him in a pit and figure it out. But then Reuben leaves. And so there's no one there to look after poor Joseph in the pit when these Midianite traders come by on their way to Egypt. And so his brothers pull him out of the pit and they sell him as a slave for 20 pieces of silver. And the crazy thing, and I read it for us, is they think they're doing him a solid. They think they're doing him a favor. We're looking out for our little brother. We're not going to kill him. I know my older brother Thomas felt that way sometimes. Like anything less than killing me was a virtuous act. And that's the way they feel. Well, we're not going to kill him. But he's sold into slavery. So this is a story that invites us to kind of try to imagine the space that Joseph might have been in, right? I mean, what was he experiencing? He lived a life of privilege. He's daddy's favorite. The future was his. He had these marvelous dreams. All that's gone. And it's even more catastrophic than that, because in the ancient world, in the world in which Joseph lived, your family, your kin, your clan was everything. Without that, you were alone in the world. You had no security. So Joseph has been stripped of that, which means he's afraid. He's a young man, little more than a boy. He's afraid. He's fearful. And we can also fairly well surmise that he's sad. He's lost his family. I know you're saying, well, it's not much of a family to lose. But his father loved him. His mother loved him. He had, extensive familial relationships. And he thought, well, maybe the relationship with my brothers isn't great, but, what are they going to do? Kill me? Well, yeah, it turns out that's pretty much what they wanted to do. And beyond being fearful and sad, I think we can also fairly well surmise that he was angry. Do you think? A little anger there. Well, okay, a lot of anger. A desire to get even. A desire to wreak some vengeance on these brothers who had done this despicable thing, utterly betrayed him and sold him as a slave. And we do well to think, how exactly might Joseph have responded under these circumstances? What were his options? Because there were actually quite a few. He could have just given in to his fear and been crushed by it and lived with a sense of kind of an unwillingness to trust or interact with anybody. And he could have given into his sadness and just been overcome by despair and utterly immobilized and unable to address the situation at all. He could have just been fueled by anger such that he was utterly consumed by a desire to get back at those who had wronged and harmed him. Joseph could have responded mentally, emotionally, even spiritually, in a lot of different ways to this fundamental betrayal by his brothers. But what we see when we read the book of Genesis is he responds in the most remarkable way. He decides that even in conditions like this, he is going to continue to trust in God, the God who has given him these dreams. Things don't look good. In fact, things look terrible. But he is going to continue to trust God. Remarkable. And this is what we see, by the way, in his story, which runs from Genesis 37 all the way to the 50th chapter. We see a remarkable experience that Joseph has in Egypt. He has some great successes and accomplishments, but also some great failures. He continues to be betrayed by people who let him down, but he continues to hold to this trust in God, even when his life looks anything other than the bright promise that the dreams had earlier conveyed to him. He maintains his trust in God under these impossible circumstances. And eventually, he comes to the attention of Pharaoh due to his ability to interpret dreams. And Pharaoh puts him in charge of Egypt to guide the nation through 7 years of famine, which Joseph does. And during this famine, who shows up looking for some food? Those brothers of his. And Joseph doesn't initially reveal himself to them because he wants to hold them accountable for what they've done to him. I mean, this is serious stuff. And he tests them in some very creative ways over a period of some time to see what kind of men they have become. And if they have not learned and grown from the experience, if they are not capable of expressing regret for what they did to him, if they have not developed their lives in a way other than this treacherous way that they treated him, well, then things aren't going to end well for them. But what he discovers as he tests them is that they have changed. They are no longer the reprobates that sold him into slavery. They've changed. And so when he dramatically reveals himself to them, he forgives them and he reconciles with them. And even though Joseph does this, there's still some of the brothers have a sense that maybe he's just putting on a show and eventually he's going to exact his vengeance upon them. And that's when we get to one of the most remarkable interchanges in the entire Bible. Joseph calls his brothers together, and this is what he says to them from Genesis 50, verse 20. But Joseph said to his brothers, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for what? For good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today." So this is Joseph's explanation for how his willingness to continue to trust in God, even when he was betrayed, even when all hope was lost, his willingness to continue to trust in God, to trust in the promise, has resulted in a state of affairs where he was positioned by God to provide for the family so that the promise could stay alive. What Joseph is saying to his brothers is simply this: the reason I can forgive you and we can be reconciled is because you have changed, but also if you intended it for harm and God intends it for good, who wins? Not a trick question. God wins. And so he was ready to move forward in life. Now, the interesting thing about this story is we might be inclined to admire Joseph. I mean, we might be inclined to say, well, this is pretty incredible. I don't know if under those circumstances I could continue to trust in God. If I was betrayed by my family, if I was cut loose as Joseph was, as mistreated as Joseph was, I don't know if I could continue to trust in God. But we're not intended to just sort of admire what Joseph did here. The author of Genesis, I think, wants us to actually consider modeling that kind of behavior, particularly when we are feeling that we are mistreated, that we have been betrayed, that we are suffering, or we are in pain, or life just seems beyond unfair. And there are actually some real benefits that can come to us if we choose, hard as it is, to continue to trust in God when life falls apart. The first thing that can happen is, even when life seems chaotic and confused and unfair, if we continue to the best of our ability to place our trust in God, it keeps us from being carried away by a whole range of unrealistic and irrational scenarios that are driven by fear. So that's what happens when you and I experience difficulties and challenges and hardships like Joseph comes to. It's very easy for us to give into our fears and to let our imaginations carry us away. It takes us out of the present, which is the only place we can experience God, and we are just hounded by fears and anxieties about what the future might bring. And that can be utterly debilitating, and it's also not real. I was reminded in thinking about this over the course of the past week of an encounter that I had when Ann and I were serving the church in Ojai. After services one Sunday, a woman came up to me and she said, hi, my name's Susan, and we've been worshiping here at the church for a few weeks, and we just love it, and just wanted you to know that we're really finding a home here and glad to be getting to know people and looking to get more involved. And I thanked her for that, and then I said, you look really familiar. Have we met before? And she said, well, no, I've never met you, but I am in the entertainment industry, and I'm an actor and a stunt woman, and I've been in some films, and maybe you remember me from that. She started to list films she was in. And none of them were particularly known to me. But then she said, the one, though, that you might be most likely to have remembered me from is the film Jaws. She said, I played Chrissy, who's the woman who swims out into the ocean at night in the opening scene and gets attacked by a shark. And I thought, wow, this is royalty here. And she went on to describe the experience. It went on for days. It was a brutal filming. There were cables connected to her and like people pulling them violently so she could be pulled through the water, kind of simulating the attack. And they got the scene, though. And I did have to say to her, I said, Susan, I got to tell you, loved the movie, loved your scene and your work in it, but you pretty much ruined summer of 1975 for me. Pretty much ruined it. Because I grew up in San Diego, right next to the beach. And we always had a thing we did. Our group, we were constantly at the beach, and often at night we'd stick around and light a bonfire. And, usually right before we went home, somebody would call out, night swim. And we'd all go rushing into the water. It was so much fun. Until July of 1975. Because that's when the movie Jaws came out, and it's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, right? Now, logically, reasonably, rationally, I knew it was no more dangerous to go in the water swimming at night in July than it was in May. What changed? Fear. And it was her scene. And she said, I get that a lot. I'm very sorry. I said, okay, Susan, it was a great film. And we got through it. But you and I, our minds are such that when we experience betrayal and loss, when there's pain and when there's suffering, particularly if it comes at the hands of people that we should be able to trust, it can pull us out of the present, and we can inhabit a future which is populated by all sorts of very negatively charged potentialities and scenarios. God didn't intend us to live that way. That's why the author of Isaiah declares, and this is such a beautiful verse, those of steadfast mind you keep in peace because they trust in you. When we trust in God, even when life is hard and difficult, it's not like God's going to keep anything bad from happening to us. It means something more profound. It means that we can trust in God as one who's going to continue to guide us and direct us through everything that life has to throw at us. And then the next thing that can come to us as a benefit if we choose to trust God, even when life is hard and seems very unfair, is that it can keep us from descending into a place where we will not be satisfied until we can wreak vengeance and justice on people who've mistreated us. Am I preaching now? Right? Because that's what we want. We want justice. And when we are mistreated, let alone betrayed, it is very natural for the human mind to want to exact vengeance and retribution. And that can consume us spiritually, emotionally, sometimes even physically. As I was pondering that this week, I was reminded of another great story from literature where we see a character taking exactly the opposite path of Joseph. And that's the novel by Alexandre Dumas, The Count of Monte Cristo. You familiar with that? Most of us have read it, right? I think, at some point. And in the novel, Count of Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantes, the main character, is having great success early in life. He's about ready to be made a ship captain, right? And he's got a friend and some acquaintances who are very jealous of him. And so they sell him out, and he is committed to prison for a crime that he did not commit. He loses everything. Edmond Dantes loses everything. And in prison, he is bitter and he is angry, but then he is befriended by a priest who counsels him, gives him an education that he did not have, and also tells him where a fabulous treasure is. And when Edmond Dantes escapes from prison, he retrieves the treasure, and then he embarks on his God-given, he believes, career of exacting vengeance and retribution on those who had wronged him. He believes God has given him this treasure to make sure that the people who wronged him suffer to the same degree, if not greater, than he himself had suffered. And what does this path in life do to Edmond Dantes? It cuts him off from everyone. It doesn't solve his bitterness, it just fuels it. And Edmond Dantes finds salvation at the end of the book, at the end of the novel, not because he has exacted all of his vengeance, but because he finally opens up to the possibility of love. He finally connects again with humanity. It's exactly what Joseph did, but without all the money and vengeance and retribution. Joseph challenged his brothers for what they had done, but when he determined that they were not the same people, he enacted a great reconciliation with them, and he forgave them and kept the promise alive and celebrated that. Because vengeance and retribution are no place for us to live. It's just a destructive place for us that is absolutely caustic and corrosive to the human soul. That's why the Apostle Paul has this counsel for us. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Some things are just better left to God, and trust me, vengeance, that's one of those things. And then finally, when we choose to trust in God, even when life is hard, even when we feel we've been betrayed, particularly by those who are closest to us, when we choose to trust in God, hard as it is under those circumstances, it really can allow us to live in a world that is so much better than the alternative. I mean, Joseph, had he chosen, could have internalized from his experience. He could have developed a worldview in which he determined that no one could be trusted, everyone will betray you. There's no way to make it in life other than just securing for yourself what you can, trust no one, and just be ready for the other shoe to drop all the time. He could have developed that kind of worldview. He didn't, because he chose to trust more in God than any harm that anyone could do. And he lays that out, you see, in the final encounter with his brothers. The confidence was rooted in his conviction, blessed by his experience, that they intended harm, God intended good, and who wins? God. And this is what the Apostle Paul is driving at in Romans 8:28, one of the most magnificent verses in the Bible. Let's read this together. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. That's foundational stuff. Joseph went through an experience where, because of a profound betrayal, where everything was taken from him, he could have become bitter. His life could have gone in so many different directions, but he chose to trust God. It made all the difference. And he's inviting us to do the same thing today. Amen.
We invite you to get to know our community better. Take a moment and subscribe to our YouTube page, or you can go to our website, lopc.org, and find additional information there. Know that there's a place for you in our community of faith, and you'll be welcome here.